Hey everyone, this is Dana with EDH Rec, and I'm here to take you through all my commander decks and where they fall on the new bracket system. We've had about a month to get used to this huge addition to deck power evaluation and the pregame conversation, and I want to take this chance to walk you through where my decks fall in this system and the thought process behind that. If you want a refresher on the new bracket system, we've already released a handful of videos going over the specifics of how it works. And Joey and Matt have already released videos about their decks, so it's time for me to talk about mine. For a quick breakdown, there's Bracket 1, Exhibition, where it's more concerned about a theme of some sort rather than winning. Then there's Bracket 2, or Core, where decks are focused and functional, but contain suboptimal cards and strategies. Both of those two brackets contain no game changer cards, and no mass land denial, and no extra turns, no 2-card combos, and no tutors. Next we have Bracket 3, which is upgraded, which is where decks are thoughtfully designed and powered by synergy, and they can contain up to 3 game changer cards, though you still shouldn't be playing mass land denial, nor should you chain extra turns together. Bracket 4 is optimized, where you're swinging for the fences with really no restrictions on the amount of game changers you can run. And mass land denial, you can chain extra turns, you can run as many tutors as you like, you can basically do almost anything. And last but not least, we have Bracket 5, which is CEDH, where you're brewing to compete in a very specific, very focused and interactive meta. You are playing functionally tournament-level Commander. The decks and the deck lists I'm talking about can all be found at architect.com and will be listed in the links below, so feel free to take a look and let me know if you agree with how I'm classifying them all. Additionally, we'd appreciate a like and subscribe on this video. So let's get started. So first of all, I don't have any decks in the 1 or 5 bracket. I found that neither of those two power levels or deck construction parameters really kind of scratch the itch that I want scratched when it comes to brewing and playing a game of Commander. And oddly enough, it's kind of for the same reason. The restrictions on Bracket 1 keep me from fully committing to whatever kind of singularly focused theme I want my deck to be doing. And to a degree, the requirement for CEDH decks to run so much stack interaction and usually combos also kind of prevent me from focusing on the theme I want to focus on. So despite being at polar opposite ends of the power spectrum, both of those brackets and how they're laid out just keep me from doing what I want to do. So as a result, I just don't play in those spaces and have no brackets that are a 1 or a 5. Currently, however, I do have 26 decks that I maintain and play, which is admittedly too many decks. There's a reason I wasn't on the show where we talked about taking apart decks, because I clearly don't do that nearly often enough. For simplicity's sake, I'm going to go down my list alphabetically, and to save repeating myself for all of my decks, let me make a note in advance. No matter what bracket my decks are in, I just don't run mass land denial or any combos at all, even in the Bracket 4 decks. That's just not the way I enjoy playing. Denying my opponent's resources doesn't really interest me, and winning with a combo is unsatisfying for me. So I'm just not running any of those things in any of my decks. I'm also not really running tutors anywhere except for the 2 decks that are kind of built around a secret commander kind of theme. Last, every one of my decks, no matter what bracket it's in, has some kind of limiter or rule regarding what creatures I can run. I'll expand on that when I get to each individual deck. I don't know why that's a thing I do, but like mentally, it feels like creatures are the place where I want to really limit what the deck can run to really commit to a theme. I limit all my decks, particularly the creature suite, to something that has to like mesh with what the deck is doing. First up, we have Arden, Intrepid Archaeologist, partnered up with SER Wardwing Familiar. I've always wanted to build an equipment deck just because, like, over the years I had picked up a couple different Judge foil copies of the, Sword of Punch and Face or whatever those particular swords happen to be. I wanted to put them in a deck, but I could never quite figure out how to make an equipment deck that seemed interesting to me. They always want you to build a Boros deck. There's a ton of Boros commanders that encourage you to build an equipment list, and encouraging me to build something is the number one way to make me not want to build it. So Boros equipment just wasn't an option at all. But Azorius equipment, that's something that we're never encouraged to do, so like that was what jumped out at me as a way to try to build an equipment deck that I found to be interesting. So, Arden SER, it's a Voltron equipment deck where the main plan is to give a bird a bunch of swords and have it just kind of slam into you at full speed. The deck has 3 game changers, Urza, Lord High Artificer, which is basically a way to tap my equipment for mana, an Ancient Tomb for acceleration, and Fierce Guardianship to protect my suited up bird. The deck is very effective, but the nature of Voltron means I'm limited to killing one player a turn, even if everything does go my way, and mass removal of artifacts is kind of the deck's Achilles heel. I've also limited the deck to only creatures that can interact with my equipment in some way, and as an extra thematic challenge here, there are no enchantments in the deck at all. Still, despite those restrictions, the deck has the 3 game changers I mentioned, and due to the protection granted by various swords, as well as SAOR's baked-in protection and evasion, it can be kind of a tricky deck for my opponents to interact with. I mean, there's no doubt about it, this is just a 3-deck, plain and simple. That's the bracket it winds up in. Number 2 deck here I want to go into is Athreos Shroud Veiled, a 6-mana commander that sits atop a deck built around the card Pestilence, or cards that do very similar things to what Pestilence does, like Withering Wisp or Crypt Rats. Roughly 70 or so years ago when Ice Age was in Standard, or what was then called Type 2, I had built a deck built around Pestilence and the Snowland using variant of Pestilence called Withering Wisps. And this deck is my attempt to make a modern day version of that list. There are 3 game changers here in this deck, 2 lands, Ancient Tomb and Serra's Sanctum, which give me a big mana boost to let me do the things I want to do. And there's a Smothering Tithe here as well for the same reason. The more mana I have, the more damage I can do with Pestilence. Both Sanctum and Tithe also tie into the deck's kind of enchantment sub-theme. There's over 20 different enchantments in this deck as well. The deck is glacially slow, however, and it's never going to threaten to take a lead, let alone win, much before on turn 8 or 9. It's also vulnerable to the removal of Pestilence effect. If I don't have a Pestilence out, it's not doing anything. I've also limited the creatures to only creatures that do Pestilence effects, so there's nothing in here that isn't some variant on a Pestilence demon. This deck would get stomped, however, by a bracket 4 deck, and although I mentioned all the weak points, it's not a bracket 2. The game changers and the fact that I can wind up in a position where I have mana and I have Pestilences out and you just can't play creatures as I slowly kill you over the course of 2 or 3 turns, it's a bracket 3 deck. There's just too many things going on for it to be anything but that. Up at number 3, we have Caliphate God of the Sea, one of my favorite decks I've brewed in the last couple of years. Like Arden and SAOR, Caliphate is a Voltron deck, generally winning by buffing up Caliphate by enchanting her with auras or by just playing cards with blue pips that ramp up her devotion. Because of the way she works, her power is set to whatever your devotion to blue is, so basically I'm playing kind of a weird mono blue creature aggro deck. Of note here is I'm running no instant or sorcery spells. Neither of those card types add to my deck's devotion, so I thought it would be kind of an interesting deck building challenge to run none of those effects, because apparently mono blue creature beats isn't enough of a challenge. So I've limited myself to only being able to counter spells by flashing in creatures that counter spells, or all of my draw effects have to be attached to a permanent in some way, shape, or form. So my game changers here are the One Ring and Heuristic Study, because I just need permanent base draw options, and there's an Ancient Tomb here to keep me up to speed with decks that are running instant sorceries for ramp. It's a bit on the slower side, but it's surprisingly resilient. It's not resilient enough to play in a bracket 4, but it can do some things that are kind of difficult to see coming, because I'm playing so many kind of enchantments that buff up Caliphate's power, and I'm copying those enchantments regularly, and I'm flashing in things that buff her devotion while making her hexproof as well. For a deck with no instant sorceries, there's a lot of things that kind of can happen in the stack here. Again, it's a bracket 3, both because of the game changers, and just it's not intuitive, I think, for people to play against. A clear bracket 3, and surprisingly strong considering the restrictions on the list. Up here at deck 4, we have Jeru with Eyes Opened, a mono-white Super Friends list. Again, it was an archetype I didn't have, Super Friends deck with all Planeswalkers, and I thought a funny way to do that would be to play mono-white Planeswalker. So mono-white, usually considered kind of the weakest color. I thought, playing mono-white Planeswalkers would be a fun challenge versus, most of the, 5-color Planeswalker decks you kind of see where you can do all of the things. My game plan here is to play Planeswalkers that create tokens, and then those tokens swing in. And so there's ways to buff those tokens, the Cathar's Crusade kind of effects. But at the end of the day, this is basically a tokens deck that makes tokens via playing Planeswalkers. There's no tutors here, obviously no combos, and there's no game changers in this deck either. I've also restricted the deck to only run creatures that interact with my planeswalkers in some way, shape, or form. Maybe that's a proliferate effect or something. So while, an Esper Sentinel will be great here to draw cards, I'm not running it because it doesn't fit the theme of planeswalker interaction. So while Zero is technically a tutor himself, there's not a lot of ways to reuse that effect short of recasting him. I think I have one blink spell and a couple sack outlets, I think 2. But primarily, I'm trying to get Zero killed by attacking or blocking in order to recast him to get another Planeswalker. And the Planeswalkers I get are just token makers for the most part. So despite, I guess, my commander technically being a tutor, this is a solid bracket 2 deck. It's slow, it's easy to see what's happening, it's relatively easy to interact with the things I'm doing. Good example of a, clear, easy to understand bracket 2 creature beats list. At number 5 here, we have Dromoka the Eternal, a Selesnya dragon typo deck with a +1 counter sub-theme. And when I say this is a dragon deck, I mean it's a dragon deck. I'm running 16 creatures, and all of them are dragons. Would a Birds of Paradise or Llanowar Elves be useful to help me ramp that stuff out? Absolutely, but I'm sticking to that sub-theme. This is not one of those typo decks where I say it's a dragon deck, but I've got a dozen utility creatures and mana dorks in the list. It's a dragon deck. That, however, means I'm running some very mediocre dragons, Foerazor Regent and Timeless Dragon, for example, just to have enough bodies to swing with. And because green and white dragons aren't exactly common, this deck doesn't get new toys very often, unlike a deck that had red. So the list isn't likely to change very often, although hopefully with the new Tarkir set, I'll get a couple things that I can maybe bump some of those really bad dragons out of the list. With an average mana value of 3.7, this is also a list filled with big, chunky bodies that have to be hard cast to see the battlefield, and I'm not running any of the legal fast mana stuff to get me there like Mana Vault to offset it. So between this and the lack of tutors, no combo, no land denial, no game changers, I feel pretty comfortable calling this a bracket 2 deck. Although I do like to make sure my opponents know that if this game goes long enough to get some big dragon butts into play, I'm just going to run you over. That's just the nature of evasive dragons. But despite that, this is going to be a bracket 2 deck for sure. 6th here, we have what's probably my spiciest deck, and that's one of my oldest as well, Edric, Spymaster of Trest. I maintain this list, but the last time I actually played this deck was at GP Las Vegas in 2019, if that tells you anything. I just don't play many games at that power level, and I don't necessarily enjoy playing at that power level either. It is running 4 game changers in Chrome Mox, Fierce Guardianship, Force of Will, Mystical Tutor, and it has the ability to chain extra turn spells together technically if I keep drawing them when I attack with the 1/1 flying men type creatures that populate this deck. Now, what's interesting here is this is the kind of deck that an inexperienced player might think is a CEDH list, but honestly, it's not really close to playing at that power level. The gulf between bracket 4 and bracket 5, it's huge. For as strong as this deck is, there's not enough fast mana and not nearly enough stack interaction to play at that level. And the lack of combos would probably make closing out games really, really hard as well. Maybe if I beefed up the combos and added like 6 to 8 to 10 more pieces of efficient interaction like Spell Pierce or Mental Misstep, it could be a fringe list. But without exaggeration, this deck is probably 25 cards away from playing in bracket 5. CEDH is a really specific thing, and this deck just doesn't make the cut, despite pretty clearly being a bracket 4 list. Up next here at number 7, we have one of my newest decks, which is Felisa, Fang of Silverquill. Felisa is a commander that when a creature you control leaves the battlefield that counters on it, you make Inkling tokens equal to the amount of counters on that creature. And this is a modular deck, so the goal here is to have these modular creatures leave the battlefield, make Inkling tokens, then those counters get moved over to another modular creature that gets presumably sacrificed or something to make more Inkling tokens, and I keep bouncing those counters around, making more and more tokens. I've been trying to build a modular deck for years, and I think with Felisa, I finally found a way to do it that's fun for me and also feels kind of unique. This deck runs no game changers, and I've limited my creatures to exclusively artifact creatures that interact with counters in some way, particularly modular creatures. And to get enough modular bodies for this deck to function, I'm running some genuinely bad cards like Arcbound Bruiser and Arcbound Stinger. I'm calling this deck a bracket 2, I think pretty clearly, both based on the amount of just bad cards in it and the dedication to that synergistic theme. I will admit, however, I've only played it probably half a dozen times so far, so I reserve the right, I guess, to change that if I get another, dozen reps in and it feels stronger than I think it is right now. But for now, I feel pretty confident calling this a bracket 2 deck because of all the restrictions, because of the bad cards, and just because of the lack of game changers, lack of combos, lack of whatever else kind of things in it that would move it up to an upgraded deck. Next here in the 8th slot, we have the first of my 4 Glissa decks. First up, we have Glissa Herald of Predation, and this was the 4th Glissa that came out, the one that makes or transforms incubator tokens. And I have filled this list with cards that either make incubate tokens or proliferate the counters on those tokens. I'm running some really suboptimal cards in this deck to make them interact in some way with those incubate tokens. So like I'm running Drown in Ichor as a bad removal spell because it proliferates counters. I'm running Unnatural Restoration as a bad regrowth for the same reason. I've also thematically limited my creature suite to only things that either make incubate tokens or proliferate them. So again, this is one of those situations where like I'm not running an Eternal Witness, no matter how good it is, because I want things that are limited to whatever my theme for the deck is. Now, the deck plays pretty well. I can put out an army of incubated Phyrexians if everything goes my way, but the amount of hoops I have to jump through to get them out there and then actually punch through for damage because nothing has trample, that makes me very comfortable calling this a bracket 2 deck. There's just, it's easy to see coming, and there's a lot I have to do to make it as effective as some other bracket 2 decks. So very clearly here, bracket 2 for Glissa 4.0, the first of the 4 Glissas. And my second Glissa deck would be Glissa Sunseeker from way back in the first Mirrodin set. This is a commander where you can tap her to destroy an artifact that has a mana value equal to the amount of mana in your mana pool, and then presumably use the mana for something else. This deck is built around, in fact, because Glissa eventually becomes a Phyrexian, I was trying to think of a theme for the deck, and that kind of made sense in a storyline kind of way. So as a result, I'm only running creatures that can make poison counters in some way, shape, or form. Additionally, because of Glissa's ability to destroy artifacts, there's a small sub-theme that lets me turn other people's stuff into artifacts using things like Liquid Metal Torque. Now, power-wise, this is not a very fast deck, and it's not terribly efficient either. Mana value here is 3.68, but because there's infect stuff and poison stuff in here, I've noticed that can kind of get a strong reaction from people. So while I think it's safe to call this a bracket 2 deck, if I'm being honest, I'm probably going to play it mostly against other people's bracket 3 decks. I think the perception of the power level of poison and infect stuff makes it feel to my opponent stronger than it is. And perception is reality, as the saying goes, and I would rather have to kind of fight uphill against bracket 3 decks, even if it doesn't feel like a bracket 3 deck, than I would have somebody feel like I'm playing something stronger than bracket 2 in bracket 2. So this is weird. I'm going to put it in bracket 2 because I do think it is legitimately a bracket 2 deck, but I'm playing this against bracket 3 decks only just because of kind of the mental response people tend to have when they see poison stuff happening in a game. Up at number 10 is Glissa Sunslayer, which, if you ignore the kind of Ship of Thesis factor, is my oldest surviving deck. This was once Glissa the Trader, but eventually turned into Glissa Sunslayer because she fit the deck's theme better. And that theme is relatively simple. I'm running exclusively Death Touch creatures, and I'm going to beat you down with bodies that have Death Touch that you don't want to block, while occasionally putting a lure effect on one of them to force you to block it and lose your whole board to something with Death Touch, while everything else punches through for damage. Like I said, this is a simple deck. It struggles against fogs, and I have no way to interact with combos. It's because it's Golgari. This is just a deck turning things sideways, swinging through for damage. Still, I've played it long enough that I know how it works, and it isn't the most intuitive deck in the world to play against, particularly because of all the Death Touch stuff. I think if I handed the list to most people, they'd call it a bracket 2 deck, and because of the lack of game changers, tutors, etc., I'm going to call it that as well. Again, I think I'm going to make a little mental note here, similar to Glissa Sunslayer with Poison. I'm probably going to mostly play this against bracket 3 decks because it just is going to make people feel bad, I think, in bracket 2. But it's a bracket 2 deck, if we're being honest, and I think if you looked at the list, you'd agree. Last but not least among the Glissa decks is Glissa the Trader. So while I mentioned before that my Sunslayer deck was once Glissa the Trader, when I converted it over, I figured, why not actually build a Glissa the Trader deck that leans into some artifact stuff she wants to be doing that I kind of didn't do when I was running her atop the Death Touch deck. So this is a deck built around recurring artifacts, and as a deck building restriction, I've limited this list to only artifact creatures, which winds up being a good bit of recursive synergy here. It also lets me reuse some artifact-based removal spells, things like Executioner's Capsule, but this deck is very fiddly. I'm sacrificing things or having them die to bring them back the next turn and recasting them and doing it again. It's painfully slow. The win condition is relatively slow as well. Again, this is just a combat damage deck, and I'm not running any overrun effects to make it easier to punch that damage through. This feels like a clear 2, and it's not a 2 where I think anyone's going to be confused. It's a power bracket 2, and it's very clearly a power bracket 2 deck here. Moving away from the Glissa Quartet to number 12, we have the pairing of Ichtekik Salvage Splicer and Malcolm Keen-Eyed Navigator, a Simic deck built around blinking Phyrexian Artificers to make Golem tokens when the Artificers enter the battlefield. This was my attempt to figure out how to build a blink deck that actually had a plan to win beyond just accruing general value of blinking value creatures. In this case, I wanted to blink Ichtekik or any of the other splicers that make 3/3 golems when they enter, and then win with those golem tokens. In addition to running 2 game changers in the form of Ancient Tomb and Fierce Guardianship, this deck is just effective despite having a limited creature suite. I'm only running splicers or blink enablers for creatures, but I can surprisingly quickly assemble a field of 3/3 golems with those splicers and blinking those splicers. And then because of the way Ichtekik works, whenever you sacrifice an artifact, you put a +1 counter on all of your golems. Malcolm makes treasure tokens, so I can relatively easily get counters on all of those golems as well. And because I'm blinking stuff, the deck can be kind of hard to interact with. I'm running counter spells for one, but if you go to remove Ichtekik, I can just blink in with a blink spell, so I can prevent your removal while also making another golem. It's just, there's a lot going on here, there's a lot to deal with, and I think because of the resilience, because of the difficulty interacting with it, I think this is pretty clearly a bracket 3 deck, and it's a relatively effective and strong bracket 3 deck as well. At lucky number 13, we have Asperia Supreme Judge, the first typal deck I ever built, and a deck that's over a decade old at this point. Back when I first built it, I had to run cards like Petrosphinx and Goliath Sphinx just to have enough bodies to fill out the roster. I think if I remember right, there were 21 legal Sphinxes and Azorius colors when I built this deck. It has an average mana value of just under 3.7, making it quite slow. And like all of my decks, I have a restriction on the creatures I run, so in this case, it's running only Sphinxes. Once again, that means there's no utility creatures here, there's no mana dorks or anything. When I say it's a Sphinx typal deck, I mean it's a Sphinx typal deck. I am no coward here. I'm leaning into my theme all the way. But this deck does have 3 game changers as an Ancient Tomb, a Rhystic Study, and a Smothering Tithe, and at least one card that probably should be one in Mana Drain. And slow or not, a control shell filled with 5/5 flyers, each of which has like a dozen lines of text, many of which draw you cards, does a lot of work in Commander. If I can survive until turn 8 or so, you're probably just going to lose. The Sphinxes just generate so much value. They all have evasion. They all do things that, put cards in hand or give me advantage. This is clearly a bracket 3 deck, even without things like combo or land denial or whatever. And this is the one deck I have besides Edric that has an extra turn spell. In this case, Metamai the Ageless can hit you and generate an extra turn next turn, as well as I have a True Conviction in here. So more often than you would think, I'm able to have double strike out when I hit someone with Metamai, giving me 2 extra turns. Oftentimes that just ends the game, but the fact that Sphinxes are big and evasive, and I can kind of control the flow of the game once I get that far into it, clearly a bracket 3 deck, and an effective one at that. At number 14 is the pairing of Jaheira, Friend of the Forest, and Agent of the Iron Throne. This is an aristocrat deck that's built around sacrificing Eldrazi spawns and scions, and Agent of the Iron Throne deals damage when I sacrifice them. I love building with limitations, as I mentioned, and in this case, my creature package is limited to things that make Eldrazi spawns and scions. That means the deck is running some pretty bad cards like Blister Pod and Nest Invader, just to have enough things that make spawns and scions. This also means I don't get to run any aristocrat effects that are attached to bodies. So like there's no Blood Artist here, there's no Zulaport Cutthroat. Still, even with that restriction and only a single game changer in the form of Ancient Tomb, this deck is more than effective. There's a handful of enchantment cards that do an aristocrat's effect. Besides having Agent of the Iron Throne in the command zone, Bastion of Remembrance, there's Funeral Room, there's Meathook Massacre. I debated actually pulling the Ancient Tomb from this list, but the reality is, even if I had no game changers, it's still going to be a bracket 3 deck. It's difficult to interact with, and it can kind of go out of nowhere when someone sees I have 8 Eldrazi spawns in place. I think they know that I can just sacrifice them to deal 8 damage, but what they don't maybe realize is that means I can tap them all for 8 mana with Jaheira out, sacrifice them for 8 more mana, deal 8 damage to them, and then I still have 16 mana in my hand to do something else that turn to deal more damage to them. Maybe that's going to be, I'm going to, convert all that mana into a bunch of treasures with Treasure Vault or something. In sacrificing them also deals damage with Agent of the Iron Throne out, because it deals damage from creatures or artifacts going to the graveyard, whatever. There's a bunch of different ways this deck can deal damage, and it's not intuitive to people unless they've played against it a bunch of times. Both for the power and the reasons I mentioned about it, it's difficult to see the wins coming. It's a bracket 3 deck, and it's a pretty effective bracket 3 deck. At 15, we have a deck that I have not even gotten to play out in the wild yet, which will make this evaluation interesting. This is Jorn, God of Winter, a 3-color commander I brewed as a Golgari deck. Now, I always wanted a Helix Pinnacle deck, and Jorn is my attempt to make that work. The way Jorn works is when he attacks, you untap all snow permanents you control. So I have a bunch of snow things that make mana. I will then use that mana to feed into the Helix Pinnacle and hopefully get 100 counters on it to win the game. I'm running a handful of tutors here to go find that Pinnacle, and a Vorinclex Voice of Hunger as part of my package of mana dumblers to double the amount of mana I'm getting from my lands that I then untap and tap them again for double the mana again. So that's 3 game changers there alone, in addition to having a handful of other worse tutors that aren't on the game changer list. So while I have not played this deck yet, there's no way I would be comfortable playing it against someone's bracket 2 deck, even if I took out the couple of game changers. But I also know it would fall on its face against a bracket 4 deck. It's just like too hyper focused on one silly thing, the Helix Pinnacle win condition. So it's going to be a bracket 3 deck, full stop. There's just no other way to rate it. And I'm going to guess, even if I get another 15, 20 games this year in with it, that's where it's going to wind up staying, and that will not have changed. The 16th deck I have is the partner pair of Kedis Emberclaw Familiar and Crom Ludovic's Opus. This deck's game plan is to swing at someone with a flying Crom while Kedis is in play, and then I buffed instant speed before damage is dealt with like Red's various versions of giant growth effects or damage doublers. So for example, I swing with Crom, and for a single red mana I can cast a Brute Force that then makes Crom a 7/7, and then say a Titan Strength, which will make him a 10/8, and then like an Unleash Fury, which doubles damage, and then maybe I'll copy the Unleash Fury as well with a Reverberate or something. So suddenly Crom's hitting for 40, and Kedis makes everyone take 40. I'll also note here that the restriction on this deck is there's no creatures in the list aside from the 2 in the command zone. It's a deck that's very challenging to interact with. It's very hard to see that coming, because you're looking at Crom swinging in for 4, and everyone's taking 4, and suddenly it becomes 40 damage. That's unless you've played against my deck, that's not going to be something you're at all ready to have happen when a 4/4 flying zombie is swinging at you. It's also running game changers here. I've got a Rhystic Study, an Ancient Tomb, a Jessica's Will, and a Fierce Guardianship. Those 4 game changers would make it a bracket 4 all on their own, but even if I remove them, like even if I dropped 1 or 2 of them out to make it technically, bracket 3 compatible, it just wouldn't be. The ability to kill people from out of nowhere in a way that they will not see coming, and it's tough to interact with because I have access to blue, so I have counter spells, things of that nature. Red has redirects. It's just a bracket 4 deck, and it's a solid bracket 4 deck at that. At 17, we have Lord of the Nazgul, a deck I finished last fall sometime, but whose concept I've been messing around with for several years. Basically, the deck's goal is to load up creatures with Cypher spells. Cypher is a mechanic from back in the second Ravnica block, where after you cast a Cypher spell, you imprint it onto a creature, and when that creature deals combat damage, it then casts a copy of that spell. So every time that creature deals combat damage from that point onward, it casts that ciphered spell. The goal of this deck is to put a bunch of these Cypher spells onto my creatures. Most of the spells are pretty mediocre, but the point is to be able to cast a whole bunch of things, kind of like a storm deck almost, and then have that deal damage to people either by making me a bunch of tokens off Lord of the Nazgul, or by using things that just deal damage when spells are cast, stuff like Sentinel Tower or Aetherflux Reservoir, which would get counters on it, and then I can do damage with the reservoir. So this deck is really vulnerable to someone removing whatever creature might currently have like 6 Cypher spells on it, and I have to have a bunch of Cypher spells out in the first place to have the deck actually work. And it's running a bunch of really, really bad Cypher spells, which is most Cypher spells, right? Like there's a couple decent ones, but by and large, they're all relatively bad. That said, because of the deck's strange nature, like people really don't understand necessarily what's happening when I'm playing it or what's going on. The complexity and the couple of game changers I'm running here as well, it's going to wind up being a bracket 3 deck. And I just don't know how to, there's no way to make it a bracket 4, and there's no way to make it intuitive enough for my opponents to be a bracket 2. So pretty clearly a bracket 3 deck here, even if it is pretty limited in that regard. At 18, we have Minsc and Boo Timeless Heroes, which is a fling deck that once, many, many years ago, was a Crush the Blood rated list. To make things a little interesting here, I've limited the deck to just creatures with a +1 counter synergy or theme, so if it doesn't do something with +1 counter, it's not in the deck. That means there will not be a Jumbo Kakatar in this list, no matter how amazing that creature would be in this deck. I'm running 2 game changers here in Ancient Tomb and Jeska's Will, but more importantly, Minsc and Boo in the command zone is just a really, really strong card, and I think even without the game changers, that alone might make it a bracket 3 deck, I think. Particularly because of the way this can also kind of win out of nowhere. People think they're safe. Yeah, I have some creature with 20 counters on it, but it doesn't have trample, and they've got plenty of blockers, and that's not going to be a problem. Maybe they even have a removal spell to remove it if need be. So they think they're fine until it winds up getting flung at them and they take lethal damage. And then maybe there's an Ozolith in play, so the counters go to the Ozolith, and I can move them to something else and then fling that thing. For the reasons I said, it being unintuitive, people not really seeing it coming, and the game changers, again, this is going to wind up being a bracket 3 deck pretty clearly. Coming in at 19 is Agnes the Dragon's Lash, a Jund deck that I'm playing as a mono red deck. I've never been able to find a mono red deck I really liked and could latch onto, and it turns out the trick to me liking mono red is to just play a Jund commander without black or green. So that's what this deck has wound up being. It's an aggro deck built around a list of creatures that I've restricted to having to have haste to make the cut, in large part because of the way Agnes works. He's got a triggered ability whenever a creature you control with haste attacks, you make a tapped treasure token. The deck has a few sub-themes here, namely various spells that let me steal my opponent's creatures temporarily and give them haste, so I can swing your stuff against you while making treasure tokens for myself and removing your blockers at the same time. It also has a couple cards like Dragonspark Reactor that interact with the treasures I'm making and let me deal damage with those treasures. There's also quite a few ways here to make my stuff difficult to block because I'm looking to attack every single turn with hasted stuff. So, Dolmen Gate or Raging River make my creatures difficult to interact with when they're swinging in. Still, despite all of those things, this is a mono red aggro list in EDH, and it's running some genuinely mediocre cards like Impetuous Sunchaser to give me enough evasive hasty bodies to swing. And because the temporary theft effects kind of scale with the power of your deck, that can only be as strong as the opponents I'm playing against. So for that reason and the lack of game changers, I feel pretty confident calling this a bracket 2 deck. It's a lot of fun. I really enjoy playing it, but power-wise, it would struggle, I think, against a lot of really smartly built, upgraded bracket 3 lists. At number 20, here is my Reki, The History of Kamigawa deck, which is another deck that's over a decade old here. The game plan is very simple. I play legends and draw cards off of Reki for playing a legend, which hopefully lets me play another legend to draw another card, which lets me play a legend to draw a card. That's rinse and repeat over and over again. It's a kind of a green, I wouldn't call it a storm deck, but it does play that way a little bit. There's 2 game changers here in the form of the legendary One Ring and an Ancient Tomb. Maybe we're sensing a pattern with Ancient Tomb in a lot of my bracket 3 decks. I've also restricted the deck to just the legendary creatures for obvious reasons, but there's no mana dorks here to accelerate me or anything. This is probably my trickiest deck to rate. It can blow people out of the water because the thing I'm doing lets me keep doing the thing I'm doing. Playing legendary creatures lets me draw cards, lets me play legendary creatures. I'm really torn on this. Like it's really, really powerful against other bracket 3 decks, but it doesn't have the tools, I don't think, to compete at bracket 4. I've got no way to stop the combos. I have no way to deal with, mass land removal. I'm not tutoring stuff up to answer other people's problems. I'm going to call it a strong bracket 3 deck, probably my strongest bracket 3 deck, but I could also maybe call it my worst bracket 4 deck. I don't really know. My plan is for now, on paper, it's a bracket 3 deck. I will call it that, and I'm going to mainly play it against other strong bracket 3 decks or weak bracket 4 decks. The rating on this deck is the blurriest of all the ones I'm talking about here. And if I recorded this tomorrow, I might have a different answer. And the week after that, I might go back to this answer. So I don't have a lot of faith necessarily in this one, but this is where I'm putting it today. At 21 is Rem Karlus Stalwart Slayer, which is a Boros Knight typo deck. I wanted a lower power Boros deck, and I've always kind of liked Knights as a creature type, so it just kind of made sense to try and combine those 2 things. Plus, it lets me run Martin Stromgald, and I love running old, obscure stuff like that. There's no game changers in this list, and I'm running some very unremarkable, would be a polite way to phrase it, cards in the form of like Gallant Cavalry and Knight of the New Coalition, because Knights don't exactly have the deepest pool among creature types. And the deck wins by just turning stuff sideways, and that's really the only way it can win. Occasionally, I might get lucky. Ren has an ability where damage dealt to permanents I control is reduced to 0. So, like a Blasphemous Act or a Chain Reaction can turn into a one-sided board wipe in this deck. But other than that, there's nothing really like clever happening here that you're not going to see coming from 3 turns away. As a result, I feel very confident calling this a bracket 2 deck, and probably one of my least powerful bracket 2 decks at all, and one I wouldn't necessarily feel terrible playing against a precon or someone's even exhibition deck. At 22, we have Silumgar the Drifting Death, my second dragon deck, and my second dragon deck not featuring the color red. As with my Selesnya Dragon list, there's nothing really here on paper that makes us a particularly scary matchup. It's slow, it has a high average mana cost, there's no game changers here, and my plan to win is to use Silumgar's ability to make attacking creatures I control give your creature -1/-1 for each attacking dragon. And I couple that with spells that reduce your creature's base power, like Sudden Spoiling or Mass Diminish. So I'm swinging with dragons that tend to hit kind of hard and removing your board state at the same time. Like I mentioned with, my other dragon deck and my Sphinx deck, a deck filled with huge evasive dragons shouldn't be ignored. I feel comfortable calling this a bracket 2 deck, but my main concern is to not match it up against someone's go wide list filled with small bodies. It's a bracket 2 deck, but like it can create a weird situation where I'm going to kind of lock out someone's elf list by every turn giving their creatures -2/-2 or something, and they just can't turn the corner. So it's a bracket 2 deck, but I'm going to avoid playing in situations where it like creates a feel bad by locking someone out of the game. At 23 is another very old deck, Talrand Sky Summoner. It doesn't get much simpler than this. I cast cheap, efficient draw spells or cantrips, each of which makes a Drake when Talrand is in play, and hopefully will draw me another cheap, draw a spell or a cantrip that I can use to make another Drake and draw another cantrip. The deck has some backup for Talrand in the form of like Alondra Sky Dreamer or Murmuring Mystic. There's a handful of creatures that make tokens when I cast spells, so it's not entirely reliant on Talrand, but removing Talrand can really slow the deck down. I also have no game changers here, and I've limited the creature pool to only creatures that make tokens off of casting spells or that draw cards off of tokens. Despite this, despite the lack of game changers, this is just going to wind up being a bracket 3 deck. It's just too resilient. There's too much going on. The synergy between like being able to draw cards and make Drakes at the same time, it's a bracket 3 deck, full stop. At 24, I have Tavash Gloom Summoner, a life gain deck that never actually lets me gain life because I spend any life gain at the end of each turn making a large flying demon using Tavash's ability. This deck isn't running any game changers, and I've intentionally kept out any life gain combos like Exquisite Blood and Sanguine Bond because that's just not what I enjoy doing in a deck. Once upon a time, it had kind of a big black mana sub-theme with lots of X spells to use the mana I made. But I've been kind of phasing that out over the years. The deck is very reliant on Tavash to do much of anything, but it also has plenty of scary cards like Cabal Coffers or Villous Broker of Blood that are very, very effective when I get them into play. I think this remains a 2, but like how my Rem cardless deck is maybe the weakest of my core decks, I think this is one of the stronger ones. It's a 2, but it's a strong 2 for sure. At number 25 is Vela the Nightclad. Vela has 2 very specific abilities, both of which matter in this deck. First off, she gives my creatures Intimidate, meaning they can only be blocked by artifact creatures or creatures I share a color with. And second, whenever a creature I control leaves the battlefield, each opponent loses 1 life. So this deck runs only colorless artifact creatures, and it has multiple ways to make artifact creature tokens, things like Hangerback Walker. So because of Vela's ability to give my creatures Intimidate, and because all the creatures are colorless, that means nothing actually shares a color with those creatures. So the only way to actually block them is with another colorless artifact creature. So very often Vela kind of functions as a spell I just cast when I want to swing in for lethal damage with stuff that basically becomes unblockable against most decks. Additionally, there's some sack outlets like Ajnad's Altar and Krark Clan Ironworks that let me mass sacrifice these creatures and creature tokens to again make my opponents lose life for each creature that leaves the battlefield. So many times I can combine those 2 things, play Vela, swing with a bunch of stuff that can't get blocked to deal some amount of damage to my opponents, then sacrifice them to deal more damage. Because there's multiple paths of victory here and the deck is fairly unintuitive in terms of win conditions, and there's a couple game changers here as well, I think this is safely a bracket 3 deck. It would struggle to do much against a bracket 4 deck, but like it would be way too much for anyone's bracket 2 deck to deal with. So clearly a bracket 3 list here. And last but not least, my combination of a Val, Candlekeep Researcher, and Haunted One. The way Val works, she can be tapped to add an amount of colorless mana to a mana pool equal to Val's toughness, but I can only spend that mana to cast spells or abilities that aren't in my hands. What's really important though is the fact that I can tap her for that mana. I don't care what I use it for necessarily, because the way Haunted One works, whenever she's in play, creatures that share a creature type with Val get +2/+0 till end of turn whenever she becomes tapped. The triggered ability that Haunted One gives your commander is not restricted to a single activation per turn. And I want to tap her a bunch of times. So like I will tap her for mana and maybe I'll use it for something, maybe not. I will definitely untap her and tap her again and do it again and do it again. So those bad, 1/1 and 2/2 wizards that I'm swinging at you with can suddenly become 13/1 and 14/2 wizards at instant speed before you know what's happening. So while a lot of these wizards in the deck are bad, things like Azure Mage or Mystic Archaeologist, it doesn't really matter how bad they are when I can pretty easily make them deal 14 damage per creature. And a lot of these bad wizards as well have some kind of mana sink ability baked in. So while I don't really care about the mana I'm making with Val, I can still use it on a mana sink and like dump it into an Azure Mage to draw a couple cards, or use it in a War Room to draw a card off the land or something. So I have a lot of mana sinks here as well to use that mana, even if it really isn't necessarily important to the deck's win condition. There are some restrictions here. You know, I'm running only wizards, and I am not running any cards that let me go infinite with Val. Umbral Mantle and Staff of Domination would do that. They're not in the deck. However, between how synergistic the deck is and how difficult to understand my game plan it is for opponents who haven't seen it before, it's a bracket 3 deck, and it's a unintuitive and relatively strong bracket 3 deck as well. Whew, okay. That was a lot. Maybe I should have been on that show with Joey and Matt and cut some of these decks. Nah, whatever. Let's see if we can get up to 30 before the end of the year. What I would really like to know here, though, is how you think I did with these rankings. You can go to my Archedeck page and look at the decks and tell me if there's something that I overrated or underrated. You know, is that Dramoka deck actually a bracket 3? Should that Jaheira deck be down as a 2? And while you're doing that, like and subscribe to this video, to this channel, and let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And remember, EDH wreck your deck before you wreck your deck.